Yeah. Well, welcome to Political Science 115. Today we are covering George Washington's farewell address. I brought a friend of mine along who is an expert in the field, my former boss, the 2010 candidate for governor of Illinois, the former chairman of the Libertarian Party of Illinois, uh, the man who married Karen Green, Lex Green.
That was my greatest accomplishment, too.
It certainly was. It certainly was. So, we read Washington's farewell address. Students completed a Flipgrid. It's an app where you can just go and record a video answer to a prompt, which we have both now in front of us. These 5 questions. But I know that you feel that you are very passionate about things like this, the founding documents, the Constitution, things like that. So I wanted to talk over Washington's farewell with you. I thought you'd be the perfect person to act as I guess, a TA in this regard
All right.
for me. So Washington, I'll put this up on the screen so the students can see it too. So he says, he gives this speech. It wasn't really a speech either. He published it as he was leaving office, and he gives a warning to the American people about what's probably coming after he leaves office, all of which ends up happening. I mean, it's a very sage piece of writing. So he believes, certain things about political parties. He's not necessarily for them.
Yes.
If you could elaborate a little bit upon that, I think the students might enjoy your perspective.
All right. So let me start off by saying George Washington is the only president we had in the history of this country that was not a member of a political party. So his perspective is particularly useful because it's kind of outside of the sphere of politics. Not to say that he wasn't involved in politics, he most certainly was. But he benefits from two things. Number one, the hindsight of seeing what happens in monarchies, especially in Europe, very pertinent to their trying to establish a new government that wasn't like the governments of Europe, which were engaged in wars and racked with all sorts of partisan politics of their own. And also pertinent to the fact that he was seeing the burgeoning party structures and fights, which were nurtured in his cabinet. Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson fought ferociously. And they were basically the fathers of the first two political parties, Hamilton, the Federalists, and Jefferson, the Democratic Republicans. So in that regard, he, like most of our more intelligent founding fathers, said we need to avoid what happened in Europe. And then at the same time, he says, but it's happening and we need to stop it. I think he makes pretty clear what he means in the address here. He basically touches on three things in this address. The first one being very brief, so I want to just go back and hit that very quickly.
Sure.
The first couple paragraphs, the way I read it anyway, is that he's saying I'm your first and only president. And this is a new country. We've never transferred power from one person to another, from one group to another, etc. Uh, and I want to reassure you that this structure, the Constitution and the American government that we have established will be the best thing for you going forward. When we transfer power, let's not throw out the system. Let's keep this system in place, and so that sets the groundwork for. Excuse me for a minute.
Yeah, sure. Go.
So this sets the stage then for the rest of the address. It's the environment under which this is occurring. So he's then trying to explain to everybody the minefield that they're about to enter. Again, watching the fights going on with Hamilton and Jefferson and their groups. And one thing that I think is prescient on his part, is that he knew how quickly this was going to evolve. In fact, a lot of people think that politics is bad today. It was actually worse after Washington stepped down. Unfortunately, the advice that he gave in this address was not taken to heart by those who really needed it. And that's usually the case, even today. When we hear a moral claim to a position, it's always the other guy that is violated, and never ourselves. And so we have to keep that into account. But anyway, so particularly important in this address. So this would be the second of the 3 points that I pulled out of this, is that the parties are not good for the country. They're not good for each of you as individuals, each of us. And of course, he was talking to the people alive at the time. But again, as Jonathan pointed out, it seems to have propagated through the years. So he's speaking to us as well. I hope you all take it to heart. But political parties then serve to, I think as he put it, they can serve a purpose, but that purpose has more meaning under a monarchy or in the systems of government that Europe had at the time, but in an elected form of government, a republic as we have, they actually serve to divide the people and then make them turn away from the apparatus meant to protect liberty. Mm-hmm. And that does seem to be what is happening and has been happening for 100 years, even more, probably for 240 years. But
definitely.
Yes. And so one of the things that he mentions is that the needs of the party or the goals of the party, though they may be appropriate for a certain number of people at a certain time, they tend to be against the general welfare, the general liberty of the people, which again is the most important thing. I think you'll see it. He mentions liberty several times in this address.
It's right here. Political parties serve always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. We're definitely seeing that right now. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which find a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passion. Thus, the policy and the will of the one country are subjected to the policy and will of another. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
very well put on his part. And
definitely.
he elaborates on some of those points more elsewhere, but in one uh, part of this, he mentions that it basically allows a party to put its goals ahead of the purpose of government as the founders envisioned it, and therefore it subordinates the true purpose of government and interjects their goals as the party's goals as more important.
Absolutely.
And
Now,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah. Now, one thing I did notice, kind of, we when going over these student assignments, um, was a confusion. They thought that Washington was advocating for isolationism, and I think I think isolationism and non-interventionism are two things that might be easily confused by students in a survey level course like this.
Mm-hmm.
Washington definitely didn't want us to go it alone. That was not ever his intention, that we should just be Fortress America.
No, as a matter of fact, he says quite the opposite in
Yeah,
this address. If you don't mind my reading an excerpt from it,
absolutely not.
uh, basically he says, observe good faith and justice towards all nations, cultivate peace and harmony with all. And then a couple paragraphs later, he says, the great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as is possible. So far as we have already formed engagements, let them be fulfilled. But here, let us stop.
Yeah,
Europe has set a set of primary interests which to us have none or remote relation. So basically, what he has said there is foreign entanglements of a military or political nature are uh, are opposed to what our best interests are. But commercial relations, friendly, peaceful commercial relations, are what he's advocating. Now, that's not isolationism.
no.
That is just not militarily or politically intertwined with the goals of other nations.
Now, I just want to mention to the students, we had agreed just to kind of go through these 5 questions in this if you want to call it an interview, I just call it a discussion between friends. Uh,
Yes.
but I wanted to uh, mention something that didn't happen this semester, but that is been said to me before. Uh, so it goes a little something like, so Washington wouldn't have uh, wanted the United States to be involved in World War II. Didn't he think there was such a thing as a moral conflict, that we had a duty to intervene in something like that? I was interested. I give my answer, but students are sick to death of hearing from me, which is why you and I are talking. I would be interested to hear your thoughts on what a moral conflict is and what the U.S. is, if the U.S. ever has a duty to get involved. And I know this is a little beyond our mandate, but if
Yeah.
you felt comfortable offering comments on that, I'd love to hear
Well,
them.
no, I don't feel comfortable because this is a really tough issue. I will throw out whatever I can.
All right.
No, it is a tough issue because at some point, um, other people in the world who aren't Americans, who don't live within the American borders, et cetera, they have rights, and certainly, if we go by what was stated as the reasoning for a lot of the conflicts we've been involved with worldwide. It was to bring about democracy, protect the rights of the downtrodden in other countries, and so on. And actually, there was a little bit of that type of thinking. Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr, they all had ideas about expanding the American experiment to other areas and other countries. But at the same time, you have to be very careful because nothing is in a vacuum and everything has consequences. Now, World War II is a very difficult one because we do know that Hitler was bent on conquest of Europe as his goal and the extermination of many people, Jews especially, because they weren't German, because they weren't ideal, they weren't what he wanted. So there was genocide, there was expansionism militarily. It was horrible. So at that point, I do see a reason to come to the assistance of people who are being downtrodden. There are a number of very important things that are prerequisites. One, the assistance needs to be requested.
Yes.
It needs to be, if we had just gone in and invaded France on behalf of stopping Germany, but the French actually wanted to be German, we would have transgressed. And if you look at some of the adventurism we've had in Southeast Asia and also in the Middle East, then you might want to ask that question: are we really coming to the aid of somebody, or are we sticking our nose in where it doesn't belong? I think the other thing that is prerequisite is you have to have an evil that is greater than the evil of the war you're going to fight. I think this is an important thing, and of course, one of my pet sayings or thinking is all of your military efforts should have peace in mind. Okay, peace and security for people, not the endless wars we're fighting in the Middle East, for example, because we don't look for an exit strategy. So when we went into World War II, we had an evil that was greater. It was already war. It was already genocide, extermination, and the subjugation of people who didn't want to be subjugated. So that evil did cry out for assistance. Whether or not we were justified at that time to go over there and get involved, I mean, the history is written by the victors, of which we were on that side. But I don't want to say that there is an absolute right or wrong here. But in this case, the evil was great enough, and there was a strong cry from the British, from the French, from even from the Russians, who actually suffered greater losses than we did. Their fighting and their suffering was immense. So our getting involved did help to stop an evil. So I'm going to say, yeah, we were justified. We were justified.
Yeah.
World War I would say less so. I didn't feel we should have gotten involved there, but World War II, I would grant you that. So is there a libertarian position, or is there a Washingtonian position that maybe we should get involved? I think that's within the realm. But again, the goal has to be peace for all and a return to normalcy for as many people, protecting their freedom and security. And I think we did that after World War II. We helped rebuild Germany. Unfortunately, then we devolved into problems with the communist Soviet Union, and that resulted in how many decades of Cold War.
Oh my
Uh,
God.
yes, so but
Yeah.
that's a whole other story.
That's a
We'll
whole,
not get into
way beyond Washington's farewell.
yeah. So so anyway, I hope that answered my opinion and gives some, I think, some insight to the reasons to go to war and the worries there are about it.
Yeah, I, it definitely did. Yeah, that, and that's a tricky one every time that question comes up. As you know, I try to explain to students, the constitutional position on things. What the Constitution says, what the courts have ruled, you know, precedent. Um, we covered the 1973 War Powers Resolution Act today, and we also we're talking about Operation Urgent Fury, the Reagan administration's invasion of Grenada. So we're getting into the presidential war powers, and we're going to get into that next. But
Okay.
we'll finish up Washington. So political parties are still around. Definitely don't have the sway that they once did. It's more of a personality thing. It's less so about Biden being a Democrat and Trump being a Republican than the personality, what Trump would do, what he is, what he's and the same thing with Biden. Uh, so the question here that they ask is evaluate the role of political parties in today's national scene. Were Washington's concerns valid for the future of the nation? I think the answer to that is yes, because they still have it's still this two-party system, and with the exception of Justin Amash, uh, it's run by the two same people, the two same, excuse me, the two same Leviathan sort of big government, big everything parties that it always has been. Has
I
that?
agree with you 100%, Jonathan. And in some ways, it's troublesome to think that the two political parties that we are still stuck with are essentially political parties. The Democratic Party started in the 1830s with Andrew Jackson, and the Republican Party started in the 1850s and supporting Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
And they're still the two parties we have. There's some differences in their platforms, to be sure, but
Well, they just about flipped the platform.
yeah, they did. But having said that, they're still in control. And this then lends itself to the discussion of modern politics and is it serving the interests of the people? Is it serving to protect our great experiment, the Republic of the United States of America, and to establish freedom and liberty, as Washington mentioned several times, as the vehicle for achieving the best welfare for the people? And I would say that that whole thing was lost many years ago, and now it's just a matter of making sure certain people who have money and power maintain their money and power.
Now, I just want to preface, I know the answer to this question. I'm anticipating a couple students in particular.
Okay.
Lex, what do you mean by experiment? Aren't we an established country? What is this experiment thing that you speak of?
Well, going back to Washington's time, I think I mentioned earlier, but people don't realize how radical of a departure from any form of government we had when we had our Declaration of Independence and later the Constitution. These were unheard of things. The other countries were all appalled, and we benefited from the fact that we were separated by an ocean from Spain, France, and England, because otherwise one of them, all of them having a presence on our continent prior to our country being established, one of them would have surely uh, taken over. A War of 1812 is proof that England had their eyes on it. They said, oh, these colonists, they're not going to survive because this is a stupid idea. The idea of electing your officials, the idea of putting the rule of law over the rule of a king. This was crazy stuff. Well, the interesting thing for us today is it's still evolving, and it's still questionable. I think a very timely issue right now is the transfer of power, just as Washington pointed out. Uh, Please be calm. Our system of government that we invented will survive me leaving office and the next person coming in. And when President Obama was reaching the end of his second term, there were so many Republicans who said, well, he's not going to give up. We're going to have to fight to get him out of office. And now we've got 4 years later, we've got the reverse, where the Democrats are worried that this guy, he's not going to give up. He's going to stay in office even if he loses the election. Well, this is how precarious our experiment is. Right. It requires us to continually be involved and guided towards the peaceful endings that we're hoping for, and stay within the confines of the Constitution, which I think we will.
I think we'll survive. Yes. So the concerns that Washington had about the nation's foreign affairs still applicable today? I say yes, definitely. Even more so because we're involved in everything, everywhere, and stick our noses in many places that they arguably don't belong. Yes. I don't think you have a differing opinion from that.
No, and it's interesting how in the past we went to war with Mexico, and there was very few people who really wanted us to, other than the military and the president at the time. We went into the Spanish-American War at the turn of the century. That again had very little support until the Maine blew up, and even before that, going into World War I was slow. We only got in the last bit of that war because Americans didn't want to go to war. And then World War II came along, and suddenly, because we were such an impact in that, our military decided at some point we were going to make sure that we were the strongest we could be on the international military side. And now we're involved in the United Nations. We're involved in the NATO alliance, the Southeast Atlantic Pacific Theater. We've got military involvements, including treaties that do exactly the opposite of what Washington said. He said, we want to make sure that we guide ourselves toward commerce and away from politics and militarism in other countries. And how are we dealing with everything today? It's all with, again, the United Nations, NATO, etc. These are military entanglements that run exactly counter to what Washington said, and the result has been that we basically keep tensions high. He mentioned not choosing another nation as an adversary because we become slaves to that adversarial position, then again, now we lose sight of liberty as our main concern, as the welfare of our people as the main concern, and being an enemy of another state as being more important. Does anybody remember Russia?
Yeah.
And yeah, at some point, if you try to become friendly with the Russians, then you're considered uh, a traitor or selling out the country. The same would go with China. How would Washington look at Russia and China today?
That's some good
I think that's a
questions.
good question for everybody to ask
Yeah.
themselves.
Yeah. You'd say stay out of it. Forget about it. That's not a concern of ours. So to wrap this, just to kind of put a bow on it, what we've talked about, Washington warns against the formation of political parties. They foment division. This was not a desirable thing with the transfer of power coming up and just for a new nation in general. Washington says stay away from entangling alliances. And this is not the same thing as isolationism by any stretch of the imagination. He wanted trade, he wanted friendly relations with all. Political parties, well, we've touched on that quite extensively. uh, they're certainly still something that I think Washington would probably not want. And the concerns that he had about our entanglement in foreign affairs have been amplified 100-fold, probably more than that, you would say. Uh, so that is the speech in a nutshell. So thank you, Lex, for talking with me about it.